Well, for now, a framework for possible agreements between Iran and some of the other world powers. With me in the studio, Mr. Teng Jianchun, here in Beijing, Director of the Center for Arms Control at China Institute of International Studies. And in New York, we have Mr. Emad Kiyaei. He is the Executive Director of the American Iranian Council. And in Boston, we have Mr. Jim Walsh. He is from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. This is a very significant day, shall we say, even though no agreement has been reached, but a framework for now has been reached. So let me ask you, first of all, Professor Walsh, what do you consider as the most important points committed by the Iranian side in this framework that the U.S. would watch very closely? Very briefly, one or two sentences from you.
Sure. I think there are a number of positive developments. I'm not going to be able to list them all. I'd say overall the U.S. Observers came away surprised at the level of detail, surprised at the robustness of the detail. One example would be around the heavy water reactor. Iran has agreed to stop construction of that reactor, start from scratch, and ship the spent fuel out of the country. That together with the better inspections and the limits on the enrichment program is quite a significant achievement.
Right. And what about you, Mr. Kiyaei? Would you explain, first of all, to the question Mr. Walsh just raised, why everybody seemed to be happily surprised? And secondly, what does Iranians consider as the most important commitments by the U.S. together with some of the other countries in the framework?
I think today, as you've mentioned, is a major breakthrough in the talks. We've been waiting for this for more than a decade for Iran's nuclear negotiations to reach some outlet. And as Jim has mentioned, Iran's commitment to this latest framework indicates that Iran will go beyond the nuclear non-proliferation treaty to make sure that the international community can verify, monitor, and have an understanding over Iran's nuclear program that is aimed for peaceful purposes. This is beyond our expectations for sure, and I think that in return we hope that the P5+1 can deliver on their side of the commitment, which includes sanctions relief, which are specifically nuclear related, United Nations Security Council resolutions, EU and the United States. We have to wait and see how they're going to phase that out, but I'm confident that this is a step towards the right direction to resolving this decade-long dispute over Iran's nuclear program.
Okay, we have positive development coming from both sides. Both sides have already committed, but the question is, will this commitment become real? Because we are only talking about a framework for a possible agreement. Any of these kinds of framework, in order to become true, will need the domestic constituency support. Let me come back to you, Mr. Walsh. Therefore, Congress needs to approve this. But it is very difficult. I would understand that this is a very split politics that we see in Washington, and Mr. Obama has been continuously frustrated by any of the foreign policy goals he's likely to reach, but not necessarily so because of Congress opposition. Will this be an exception?
Well, a couple of things. One, I wouldn't minimize the value of a framework agreement. Sometimes the political decisions up front are harder to make than the technical definitions at the end. So this was a big deal politically. Just because it's a framework doesn't mean it's a big deal. It is. As to Congress, you're absolutely right. There are Republican majorities in both the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate. Many of those Republicans don't want to accept any deal, no matter how good it is. They are with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in rejecting every possible diplomatic deal that might be done. They're going to try to undermine the deal, but the problem for them is they might be able to pass a bill But can they sustain a veto? Because under the U.S. system, the president can veto a bill passed by Congress, and then they're going to have to get Democrats to vote to sustain that veto. As to the review, most agreements are not reviewed by Congress. If you look at less than 1% of agreements, it's really only treaties that get voted on by Congress, but the Republican opponents to this agreement will try to bring it to a vote. That's what they're working on right now.
Well, maybe if there is going to be a further talk on the agreement, maybe there can be a narrow escape, shall we say, at least according to you, Mr. Walsh, from the U.S. Congress. But let me go back to you, Mr. Kiyaei. What about from the Iranian side? Now, there has been a lot of reports that the Iranians have been talking to their local constituencies suggesting this is a breakthrough. But we also understand the Iranian side has made a lot of concessions, as you just earlier mentioned. So Iran's politics is not also one-person politics. There has to be a building of consensus as well. Will that be easy for Tehran?
Well, there's 2 points here. I mean, the Iranian domestic political scene, ironically, is very similar to one in Washington. We do also have our conservatives and those hardliners who are opposing a nuclear deal and any type of it. However, in Iran there's a slight difference. The Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, has been backing these talks from the beginning, and this gives his weight to a possible breakthrough. And this is the most important part. While there is some opponents of the nuclear deal, overall the Iranian public is a pro towards a diplomatic resolution to the nuclear file and a lifting of sanctions. This is important. And on top of that, we have an administration of Rouhani and led by Zarif in the talks, the foreign minister, who are really pushing towards making a breakthrough. Now, the devil is in the details. Iran did make major concessions on its nuclear program. But I believe that if the P5+1 can deliver on the sanctions relief and normalize Iran's nuclear file, and in addition, we can prove that Iran's nuclear programs for peaceful purposes, it will be a benefit for the non-proliferation initiative in the region and globally.
Well, certainly, if there is going to be an agreement, it's going to be very significant for our world for decades. But as you said, we are not yet there, even though framework is already significant. Let me ask you, Mr. Tang, what Mr. Kiyaei said is exactly to the point. That is, the international community P5+1 already agreed to have the sanctions erased if Iran takes action according to the timetable. But here's the thing. It is not necessarily likely to happen that the sanctions will be erased smoothly. And therefore, there could be very hard negotiation process, or even though there's likely to be an agreement, to implement any possible agreement in that regard would be extremely challenging. Mr. Tang.
Yeah, I think the coming in the 90 days should be a hard time for all the parties concerned, especially after the agreement. Actually, this agreement is a political, agreement among the parties concerned, especially between the United States and Iran. The Secretary of State John Kerry stayed in Lausanne, in Switzerland, for 8 days. It was quite rare for the chief advisor in diplomacy to President Obama could spare such a time.
But my question is not just the significance of it, but rather really how to do this next, because talking about the raise of sanctions, this is the difficult. There has to be a timetable for the Western powers also to do that, but not necessarily many would believe to be smoothly. So that will create enormous amount of problem along the road.
Of course, this is a very tangible issue for decades there. I think after the political consensus reached this time, I think this is the foundation for the experts on negotiation. Just to find a way out of dilemma, especially in technology.
I can see Mr. Tang, as a technical expert, is very intoxicated now about this at the moment framework. I know, sir, you've been working on this for decades about the nuclear disarmament. So we'll let you to celebrate that for a while. But let me go back to you, Mr. Walsh. What about the implementation also from the U.S. side for erase of sanctions, given the domestic fight that you have now in Washington?
Well, I think that's the most important question, and you're right to ask about implementation. You know, the record there is so-so. We haven't always, sometimes we've made promises, we haven't always been able to follow through on them. I think the Europeans will certainly lift their sanctions. The president has sanctions that flow from the executive branch only. That is presidential sanctions. He can lift those without Congress. And then for some of the congressional sanctions, he can invoke waivers on those congressional sanctions. But, you know, that's not going to be enough for Iran. Iran's going to want these sanctions repealed. Congress is going to fight that. So that is going to be a tough thing. It's also, I think, remember the language was no nuclear sanctions. There may be some people who try to undermine the agreement by passing new sanctions on Iran, but saying therefore something else like terrorism. And that, of course, would undermine confidence that the U.S. is actually following through on its commitment. So I think it will be difficult. You're right to put your finger on that.
Let me go back to Mr. Kiyaei. 2 points. One is that even in the framework for any possible agreement, there's already mentioning of, quote, scale back of these sanctions once Iran, quote unquote, has not implemented their commitments. But of course, these are all up to interpretation, all of these phrases. Secondly, we are going to see if there is going to be any framework at all. It goes beyond this administration during the very first stage of implementation. So this is going to be a huge political risk that Iran will be taking if there's going to be even any agreement. So, Mr. Kiyaei, would you like to help us to understand the realities here? How much really do the two sides, U.S. and Iran, have this mutual trust to let them go through this process? Mr. Kiyaei.
Spot on. I mean, the issue of trust and mistrust between Iran and the U.S. is a major obstacle. It is not going to be erased overnight. Iran and the U.S. have marred relations for 36 years, and nuclear negotiations alone are not going to erase that. That's first and foremost. Secondly, on the issue of commitments on both sides, there is a precedence for this. The interim deal that was signed in November 2013 gave an indication of what both sides can do between the P5+1 and Iran in terms of their commitments on paper, and they have delivered. I mean, the IAEA, the UN nuclear watchdog, has indicated that Iran has fulfilled all of its commitments under the interim deal. Now, if we go with that line of thought, then it's possible that if there is a comprehensive deal, and let me emphasize that we don't have a deal yet.
No, we don't.
A lot has to be done in the next 3 months for a deal to happen. Now, let's assume the deal is signed on June 30th. If it does, we hope that both sides, having invested so much political capital in the process, will be able to not renege on their policies and on their agreements. So I'm confident that they will go through with their commitments. However, as Jim has mentioned, the sanctions regime and the sanctions that have been placed on Iran are comprehensive. Not only do we have United Nations Security Council resolutions on Iran, we have EU sanctions and unilateral sanctions by the United States. This is going to be an ongoing process to be able to lift those crippling sanctions that have caused a great deal of harm on the Iranian economy and people.
Let me come back to you, Mr. Tang, because we are not only having the United States and Iran face to face, but also having the other 5 countries together with them to witness this moment and also make their contribution so that a framework can be done for now and agreement possibly in the future. How much will the other 5 countries be the stabilizing factor in a way for an agreement to be possible?
Actually, Iranian nuclear is big bargaining between the United States and Iran. But the other parties, especially China, France, Germany, and the UK, have played very important role, in the negotiation, especially China, since its participation in this, negotiation, as mentioned by our Foreign Minister Wang Yi recently. I think this is very important, key role, when the negotiation reached a crucial moment. China, should be the most important, mediator, to pursue all the parties to continue their contact and dialogue.
Right.
So this is I think all the countries, should, continue the effort, in pursuing, all the parties concerned going ahead.
Well, the agreement, or rather the framework for now, should be celebrated. We are doing that. But most importantly, we should think about those next few steps before any agreement can be reached. Professor Walsh, therefore, from you, very briefly, what do you think are some of the most important steps according to your blueprint for the negotiators? Very briefly from you, then we go to Mr. Kiyaei, and then we wrap up.
Yeah, I think I can put it in one sentence, and it's what we've already discussed. The most critical thing going forward is sequencing of sanctions relief, and also keeping spoilers, those who oppose the deal, from engaging in behaviors that will undermine the agreement. If we can work out the sanctions relief sequences, keep the hardliners, out of the way, then I think we'll have success.
All right, Mr. Kiyaei, what do you think?
I totally agree with Jim Walsh, and I will just add that we have to make sure that we continue the political will, in addition to understanding the technical issues, to be able to make this happen. We've got to make sure that the spoilers of diplomacy are sidelined, and we do not empower those who've been pushing for the derailment of this deal.
I see.
It's going to be a hard work ahead.
It will be. Mr. Teng, final word.
Yeah, while we're celebrating, the agreement today, I'm sure we should look at the challenges we're facing now. In the history, for example, in the DPRK nuclear issue, there was, agreement, there was, action plan, but they all failed. So we should celebrate the agreement, but we should also look at the challenges.
Once again, we want to emphasize we are not having yet a final agreement. We're having a framework on base of which we can work for an agreement between Iran and the United States and some of the other countries. It is a wonderful occasion to celebrate because it means a lot for the international nuclear disarmament. It means a lot for the reordering of the region. It means a lot for diplomacy worldwide. Gentlemen, thank you so much for this round of discussion. Thank you very much for your insight on this very important occasion. Thank you. Stay with us here on World